AWS specifically for AI and ML.
Yep. And I think the core value prop here is really to help guide folks in terms of selecting and utilizing the right AWS databases to build effective AI and machine learning workflows.
Right.
Because, with AWS, there's a ton of different options.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that can trip folks up, right? It's just like, where do I even begin?
Yes. Yeah.
This book, attempts to address that by, going through some of the common pain points that folks have around database selection for AI and ML use cases. Some of those challenges might be like things like, how do I do vector search with a database? How do I securely connect my database to a service like SageMaker for training?
Right.
How do I even do feature engineering within a database?
Yeah.
So these are all common issues that folks struggle with.
Yeah, and it's not just the typical suspects in the AWS database landscape. I mean, they're hitting on Aurora, of course, which is like sort of the workhorse.
Right, the bread and butter.
Yeah, but then you've got DocumentDB and Neptune Analytics and MemoryDB and OpenSearch and all of these different things that can play a specific role for AI and ML tasks. So let's just jump right into it. What are some of the main advantages that someone can expect to get out of reading this book?
Yeah, so one of the things that the book does a really good job of is demystifying database selection for AI and ML workloads. So it gives you a framework for how to think about selecting a database based on your specific AI and ML use case.
Okay.
And so some of the things that the book emphasizes in terms of that selection process is first like data format. Right. So are you dealing with structured data, semi-structured data, unstructured data vector embeddings?
Yeah.
That's one key factor.
Right.
Another was the access patterns.
Okay.
Right. So, is it more batch oriented? Is it more real time? Is it more streaming? And then obviously you have things like latency requirements.
Right.
If you need sub-millisecond latency, you're probably not going to go with a traditional relational database.
Yeah.
And then, you also have things like scalability, performance, and cost control, which are all like, key considerations for any database workload. But I think especially for AI and ML where, you might have a lot of data, a lot of compute. And then last but not least, how well does it integrate with the other AI and ML services that AWS offers? So, things like SageMaker, Comprehend Bedrock.
Right.
You want to make sure that your database can talk to those services seamlessly.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like it's got to be a cornerstone of your entire, AWS platform or environment.
Exactly. Yeah.
For AI and ML.
It's got to be kind of like that foundational layer that everything else sits on.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's one of the key advantages of this book is it just like helps you wade through all of that complexity.
Yeah.
And come up with like a clear set of criteria for choosing a database.
So once you've, decided on, what kind of database that you might want to use, what's the next kind of benefit that you get out of reading this book?
Yeah, so another advantage of this book is it provides a lot of like practical integration examples.
Okay.
So it's not just like, here's the theory of how you might use this database.
Right.
It actually like shows you concrete code examples. And I think one of the most interesting examples that they cover is Aurora ML.
Right.
Which is basically this capability where you can directly invoke AWS ML services like Comprehend and SageMaker from within Aurora. So whether you're using Aurora, PostgreSQL, or MySQL, you can actually make calls to those services directly from your SQL queries.
That's pretty amazing.
Which is pretty cool, right?
Yeah.
And they give you a specific example of like a customer feedback analysis and churn prediction workflow, where they basically use Comprehend and FAT to analyze customer reviews that are stored in Aurora to understand sentiment. And then they use that sentiment data along with other customer information in Aurora to train a SageMaker model to predict churn.
Right.
And then the prediction results are written back into Aurora.
Right.
So it's like a really nice end-to-end example of how you can use Aurora ML to like simplify your data flow.
So it's all kind of happening right there in Aurora.
Exactly. Yeah.
Without having to move data, from service to service.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to like extract the data out, put it in S3, and then like run a SageMaker job on it.
Right.
It's all happening like right there within the database.
I mean, that's going to be huge from like an efficiency standpoint.
Yeah, exactly. And like from a cost perspective as well. Right. Because, data egress can be expensive.
It can be. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so I think that's a really cool example that they cover.
So Aurora ML sounds awesome, but are there any kind of limitations or things that, that the book talks about that you need to be aware of if you're going to use Aurora ML?
Yeah, so the book does a good job of like providing a balanced perspective.
Okay.
So they do point out some limitations of Aurora ML.
Mm-hmm.
For example,
Yep.
there's a limit to how much data you can send to Comprehend SageMaker in a single call.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have like a really large payload,
Yeah.
you might need to like chunk it up.
And then there's also the potential for added latency because you're basically making network calls, between Aurora and those other services.
Right.
So, it's not like it's a magic bullet.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a very useful tool.
Right.
For certain use cases.
Okay, so it sounds like this book also gets down to brass tacks and addresses specific AI and ML workflows.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not just about general database advice, right? It's about how different databases excel in particular AI and ML scenarios. Can you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, so, one workflow that they talk about is vector search, which is, becoming increasingly popular.
Especially with the rise of large language models and generative AI and all that.
Exactly, yeah. So vector search is all about, like, finding similar items based on their vector representations.
Right.
And so the book talks about how you can use databases like DocumentDB, MemoryDB, which is powered by Velky, and OpenSearch to do vector search.
And they actually provide guidance on like how to implement vector search within each of those services.
Right, right.
So it's not just like, oh yeah, you can do vector search with this database. It's like, here's how you actually do it.
Okay, here's the code samples, here's
Exactly, yeah.
the best practices and all that.
Exactly, yeah.
So that's really cool.
Another workflow that they talk about is real-time ML pipelines.
Okay.
So, if you need to process data as it arrives and make predictions or decisions in real time, they talk about how you can use DocumentDB change streams to trigger AWS Lambda functions whenever data is updated.
Okay.
So you can basically do like real-time analysis and potentially kick off like downstream ML processes.
Right.
In response to those data changes.
So you're talking about Aurora ML before. You were giving the example of like sentiment analysis and customer churn prediction.
Right.
Would that be considered a real-time ML pipeline, or is that something separate?
It could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on like how you set it up.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if you were to like trigger that churn prediction model every time a new customer review came in, then yeah, that would be considered a real-time ML pipeline.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, there's different ways to implement these pipelines.
It
kind of goes through some of the different options.
Cool. And then another big part of any ML project is feature engineering.
And it's interesting to hear that the book even explores doing some of this data preparation right within the databases themselves.
Right.
Yeah, so one of the things that they talk about is how you can leverage the aggregation framework in DocumentDB to create features. So, things like grouping data using window functions.
Right.
You can do all of that within DocumentDB.
Okay.
They also talk about how you can use Neptune Analytics, which is, their graph database service.
Right.
To generate features based on like the relationships between entities in your graph.
Right.
And then obviously you can always use SQL to do feature engineering in Aurora.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different options.
So it seems like it's a pretty big advantage to be able to do that feature engineering, right there in the database, as opposed to having to extract the data out, do the feature engineering somewhere else, and then, re-import it or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it just like simplifies your workflow.
Right.
You don't have to like move data around as much.
Right.
And it can also be more performant because, you're doing the processing close to the data.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about some of the more advanced AI and ML applications like knowledge graphs?
Yeah, so the book also covers knowledge graphs. And specifically, they talk about how you can use Neptune Analytics to build and query knowledge graphs.
Okay.
And so, for those who aren't familiar with knowledge graphs, they're basically like this way of representing entities and their relationships. in a graph format.
Oh, okay.
And they're really useful for like natural language processing tasks,
Right.
like understanding the context of text, and also for things like retrieval augmented generation,
Right.
or RAG, which is like a really hot topic right now,
Yeah.
where you basically use a knowledge graph to like ground your large language model
Right.
with like specific information.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, knowledge graphs are like a really powerful tool.
Mm-hmm.
And the book does a good job of like explaining how you can use Neptune analytics to build and query them.
And so, we were talking about Neptune before, and you were mentioning some of its capabilities for things like recommendations and fraud detection.
Right.
Would that also be kind of in the realm of knowledge graphs, or is that something separate?
Um, it's related. Yeah. I mean, like, knowledge graphs can be used for those types of applications.
Right.
But like the core capability of Neptune is really like graph analytics. So, whether you're using it for knowledge graphs or for recommendations or for fraud detection,
Yeah.
it's all about like analyzing the relationships between entities.
Right. Right.
And so, that's what makes Neptune so powerful.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the book talks about using multiple databases for RA, like MemoryDB and Neptune and OpenSearch. So it's not just like a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right. Yeah. I mean, each of those databases like brings its own strengths to the table.
Right.
So, MemoryDB is really good for like low latency retrieval. Neptune is really good for like complex graphed traversal.
Okay.
And then OpenSearch is really good for like search and analytics.
Right.
So, depending on your specific RA use case,
Yeah.
you might choose one database over another.
Right. And it sounds like the book kind of helps you understand how to make those decisions.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about functionality, in different, AI and ML use cases. But, when you're building a system in the real world,
Right.
there's also like the underlying aspects of security and scalability. Does this book address those as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So they talk about how to secure your databases using things like IAM roles, VPC endpoints, KMS encryption.
Right.
And they also talk about how to scale your databases using things like Aurora serverless v2 and MemoryDB sharding.
Right.
So, they really cover the gamut.
Yeah.
In terms of like making sure that your databases are both secure and scalable.
And that's, really important for production-ready systems.
Exactly.
Because if your database goes down or it gets hacked,
right.
That's a big problem.
Yeah, you're kind of dead in the water at that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, security and scalability are like super important.
So who is this book really for? Like, who do you think would benefit most from reading it?
Yeah, so I think this book is really for anyone who's building AI and ML solutions on AWS. And, that includes data scientists, machine learning engineers, data engineers.
Right.
And even like solutions architects.
Okay.
Anyone who's involved in like designing and building these systems, I think would benefit from reading this book.
So it's really kind of a soup to nuts guide to using AWS databases for AI and ML.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I think that about wraps it up for our deep dive into AWS databases for ML architecting intelligent data workflows. If you're looking to build intelligent applications on AWS and you want to make sure that you're choosing the right database for the job,
right.
I think this book is definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
All right. So until next time, happy building.